The National Security Forum was started by a local man with a very interesting history, Colonel Dr. Tyrus W. Cobb. Ty, you have a local history, certainly started with your father. He was a well-known newspaper man and sports writer here in the 50s and 60s. You have roots in the Comstock, but you ended up leaving Northern Nevada at an early age.
I did. We, as you said, grew up here. Generations of families have been in Nevada. On my mother's side from Tonopah, as you said, my dad's side of Virginia City. But after graduation from the University of Nevada, I was commissioned in the Army and fortunately was assigned to duty in northern Italy. And I was part of a detachment that controlled nuclear weapons until actual war was declared, at which time we would turn them over to the Italians. So my operating base was actually an Italian Air Force base, and I headed up a detachment of Americans charged with the responsibility of keeping control of the nuclear weapons until they were released to the Allies.
But you ended up, of course, along with everyone else, pretty well getting dragged into Vietnam.
Well, my girlfriend, Sue Ellen, came over and we got married in Venice by the mayor. And we were going to then get out and I was going to go to law school. And we talked it over. I said, you know, I really feel I should go to Vietnam first. And she agreed. So by the time I was ready to go, she was pregnant with our first child. And I went to Vietnam in 1966. And a month later, our first child, Jenny Sue, was born in Reno.
And did you end up going back to law school after that tour in Vietnam?
A funny story, Brent. I was there in the headquarters, and I was a duty officer one night, and there wasn't much to do but look at old Army magazines. And I came across one that said, hey, if you're interested, become a foreign area specialist. We'll send you to language school, to graduate school, and to the country area that you're going to become a specialist. So I asked Sue Ellen, and she said, oh, that's might be fun. So I did, and the Army accepted me into the Soviet Foreign Area Specialty Program, which entailed a year of Russian at Monterey. Graduate school was at Indiana. And since we couldn't go to Moscow or Soviet Union, there was a simulated Russian environment in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany, where all the classes were taught in Russian, so we did that.
I had no idea that that existed. You had a fake Soviet Union in Germany.
U.S. Army Russian Institute, once you walked in the doors, you were expected to speak only Russian. All of the instruction in the classes were taught in that language as well. So after completion of the course, and now I'm a certified Soviet specialist, the Army, in all its wisdom, sent me back to Vietnam again.
Lots of Soviets there, I'm sure.
Well, it was, what was interesting is that I wound up being on the American delegation to the Four-Party Peace Commission set up by the Paris Peace Talks. And the observer nations were Canada, and I reasonably spoke that language, Indonesia, which I didn't, Hungary and Poland. Well, the Hungarians and Poland's who came didn't have a common language except Russian, so my Russian was as bad as theirs, and it came in handy for that period of time.
You did some interesting things during that,
yes,
basically the closing down of the war.
The Paris Peace Treaty, which was signed on January 26, 1973, required all Americans to be out in 60 days and all of our prisoners of war that were held by the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese to be released. So on that day, it also specified that the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong would send delegates to the South as observers, along with these four nations I mentioned. And that required me to go to Bangkok that morning to meet the delegations flying in from Paris, the North Vietnamese, who were our enemy the day before, and Viet Cong, and bring the North Vietnamese and VC to Saigon to begin the implementation on an American plane. The next day I went to Hanoi on an American jet, Air Force, and with a pilot, colonel who had been flying combat missions up the Red River, and now we're flying up the coast and we turn up the Red River at, I still remember, 88.5 degrees, And now we're in contact with Hanoi, the Jalam airfield. And when they said come in at 88.5, we did just that because they didn't trust us, we didn't trust them. We had F4s and F5s stacked up 5 minutes away if anything happened, and we knew they had anti-aircraft guns all along the way poised. So it was a dicey situation, but we landed that morning at Jalam airfield to begin the process of bringing North Vietnamese and Viet Cong to the south. And one funny story, as we landed there, remember, the peace treaty was accelerated by the Christmas bombing that we suddenly did with B-52s. And so the airfield had craters and buildings blown down. And my escort officer was a North Vietnamese colonel who spoke some English. And we're looking around, he said, "Major Cobb, you must forgive the condition of our airfield, but we had a slight accident here last month." The B-52 strikes. We got all of the American troops out within 60 days, except for a few of us remaining on the commission. And on the 61st day, we left, the last Americans. Now, I was too junior to get on the plane last to be the last American to leave, so I waited when we landed at Elmendorf Air Force Base in Alaska till everybody else got off so I could step off and say, I'm the last soldier back from Vietnam. And I think it was true.
So what happened after the war?
Well, after the war, I'm still in the Army, and I went to work in Washington for Army Intelligence, which is not a contradiction in terms, by the way, at the Pentagon, 3 years, and after Command and General Staff College, I had applied to be a professor at West Point, and I was asked to go to the academy to teach, and wound up become a tenured professor there, and so we were at West Point for 7 years.
That sounds like a wonderful experience.
It was really great, and I was able to continue consulting with various U.S. agencies in Washington, including the White House under President Carter. So I consulted with the Carter National Security Council staff for 2 years, and then when Reagan was elected, I knew many of those people, and they asked me to stay on to be a consultant to the Reagan NSC staff.
And that turned into a much bigger job.
Well, the National Security Advisor was Judge Clark initially, and then Bud McFarlane, and then Admiral Poindexter asked me to come down for 2 years on leave from West Point, which I did to work on the Soviet European desk at the White House. And after 2 years, suddenly there's new leadership in the Soviet Union, and no longer Brezhnev and 84-year-old Konstantin Chernenko. Now we have this bright, young, reformist-minded guy called Mikhail Gorbachev. So my bosses asked me to stay on. West Point granted that. After 3 years, West Point said either come back or you resign your professorship. And the White House wanted me to stay, so I did, and wound up staying at the White House until January 20th, 1989 at 12 o'clock, when it was George H.W. Bush as president, and Reagan saluted, got in the jet, and went back to California, and I was out of work.
But you did some interesting things in the meantime. You were right in the middle of some of the biggest negotiations going on in the world at that time.
Well, that's correct. As I said, the Soviet Union leadership had been in stasis, and Reagan was trying to get something going with Chernenko or Brezhnev or Andropov, and to no avail. Reagan famously said, well, I want to get something going, but every time I try to call them, nobody answers. Then in March of '85, Gorbachev, this bright, young, reformist-minded leader, comes to power, and they began the discussions about a summit. And finally, I remember, we got a telegram from Gorbachev proposing a summit in various locations. We chose Geneva, and so in 1985, I was the executive director for the American team that accompanied the president to Geneva to begin the discussions and negotiations with then General Secretary of the Communist Party, Mikhail Gorbachev. Reagan had proposed some ambitious concepts, And finally, late at night, the negotiating teams got agreement. The Soviets began to budge off their hardline position. And I remember getting a call from one of the negotiators said, because I'm writing the president's speech for the next day, is it a success? Is it a failure? And they said, the Soviets just caved on a key point. I think they're going to move on another one. The summit's going to be end in a successful arms control agreement, and it did. So the next morning, Reagan and Gorbachev met, they shook hands, signed the agreement, and I was totally exhausted. So in 1986, we went to Reykjavik, and knowing that the Soviets needed a respite from their arms buildup to take care of crushing problems in the economy. What we were prepared for when Gorbachev came, he unloosed these proposals that went far beyond the reduction of armaments that we had anticipated. But there was a catch. In addition to everything we wanted and more, Gorbachev said, oh, by the way, the only thing you have to do is not pursue your strategic defense initiative.
Star Wars.
Star Wars, or SDI. And that, as you know, Brent, was near and dear to the president. And he was saying no, and we're up in Reykjavik thinking they're going to give us all of these concessions, and all we have to do is give up a program that's kind of doubtful if it's going to work. You know, the idea of knocking one of these missiles out of the air with another missile seemed pretty far-reaching at the time, but a lot of the American delegation, I'll be frank, didn't believe SDI could work, but one person did.
And that was the president.
And that was the president, and that mattered. So Reykjavik collapsed on that. And the next year, Gorbachev came to Washington in 1987. They signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, and then the next year, 88, Reagan went to Moscow and they signed the Strategic Arms Limitations Agreement. So in the end, by the time Reagan left, we had established a tremendous regime of armaments reductions.
That's pretty remarkable.
It was.
So was it worth giving up your West Point commission?
Well, I always hold West Point near and dear, and wanted at some point to go back, but being a critical part, I think, of those intense negotiations and far-reaching agreements made it worthwhile. Sure.
So what do you do as an unemployed Soviet specialist?
Well, we took a vacation, and I wasn't sure what to do. Then I got a call from the Center for Naval Analyses. Now I'm an Army officer, and I knew they did all this Navy stuff, and they said they really wanted to get serious about strategic issues, and my background would lend it to going there to head up their work on things that were beyond just naval interests. So I spent 4 great years there. Then I had my own consulting firm in Washington. But we had a call, and we really wanted to be on the West Coast with aging parents. And I was asked to be in an interview process for a position in California. And so I asked the search firm, well, this is a thing called Yosemite National Institute. What does it do? He said, well, they basically do environmental and science education using the national parks as the venue for school groups. I said, I'm a Soviet specialist, Army, 26 years. I'm not really an environmentalist, but the match was there. They asked me to come and be the CEO of this organization that had operations in the Marin Headlands near San Francisco, of course, Yosemite National Park and Olympic National Park in Washington. So it was a wonderful opportunity.
So you came back to Reno,
right?
And you basically pursued a rather unusual career here.
That's right. I took over a business group from General Partlow, the Northern Nevada Network, and began bringing a few folks together. We initially did it at the Gold and Silver Cafe, the Good and Slobber, and 7 or 8 of us would meet to talk about national security issues, and the interest seemed to grow. We expanded beyond that and went to various venues, including the Sienna and then the Ramada and Harrah's, and we decided to form an organization, and we called it the National Security Forum. of Northern Nevada. We've grown so much that at some of our meetings now, Brent, we've had over 300 attendees at our breakfast meetings. And I think it's in good hands, so I'm stepping back as, once again, as a former. I think they're going to call me senior advisor or counselor. But Dr. Maureen McCarthy, who is a renowned specialist in environmental and nuclear issues, will be taking my role in organizing the programs and commentary.
And what will you be doing?
I'll be observing, I think they say, and my wife Sue and I really are planning to do more travel, like to get back to Europe, and just relaxing and spending time with the 5 kids and grandkids, 3 kids and 5 grandkids.
You've had a pretty good career for a local boy. I'd say it's definitely local boy done good. When you look back at your own legacy, what do you value most?
I think the time with President Reagan, the 6 years I spent on his National Security Council staff, where we transformed the Soviet-American relationship from one that was harsh and on the verge of nuclear confrontation to a working arrangement that diminished the threat of nuclear warfare across the board. That was probably the highlight of my career.
Not bad. As Reagan said, not bad at all.
Not bad at all.
And also, we should mention that Ty was named Distinguished Nevadan of 2017 by the University of Nevada.
That's correct. It was a great honor to be given that designation by the university where I graduated back in 1962.
So there's a little background of the gentleman who formed the National Security Forum. And Ty, on behalf of the community, thank you very much for your service to your country and your continued service to this community as you help us learn about world affairs.
Brent, thank you very much for this opportunity.